What is it?
I was just introducing myself.
All right. Thanks. How y'all doing? Okay. So my topic for pressure is about deadlines. So as Mr. Lang or Dr. Lang mentioned, my background before teaching was in newspapers, public relations, professional photography. Everything I've ever done has always been deadline driven. So I'm going to tell you about origins of deadline in a second. And we all know that word. Some of y'all might like deadlines and thrive on them. Some of you might hate them and dread them or avoid them. But you got to think about them. And if you think about it, you know, we use them every day. I mean, you're going to graduate because of deadlines, right? If you think about it, I mean, if some of y'all might be seniors, you had a deadline to apply for graduation. You've got a deadline to register for classes. So we get all that. You know, if you pay bills and have loan payments, you're meeting deadlines. One thing that's bothered me is I keep running into these things on online discussions where people talk about deadlines being arbitrary, like they're just kind of made up and they don't mean anything, and people can move deadlines and it's not a big deal having deadlines. You know, tell the IRS that, right? Tell the IRS that deadlines don't matter. Tell the power company that deadline doesn't matter. They do matter, and they definitely matter if you're working in anything writing or media related. All right. So the first use of the word deadline, the first recorded use of deadline came during the Civil War in 1864. That's the first time it appeared, that it was recorded. And it's kind of like a very literal definition. So that I had some good images I could show you of this. You can find them pretty easily online. But there was a do not cross line in prisoner of war camps. And so many of you might have heard of Andersonville. That was a pretty bad Confederate camp, maybe the worst. There was some very much similar camps on the Union side. There was one at Point Lookout. And they had these lines where you couldn't cross. Sometimes there wouldn't even be a wall. So you might have a wall with what was called a dead line several feet off the wall. In some places, they might only have three walls and nothing but just this line. So what the dead line was a line that prisoners could not cross over. And so the orders were anybody that crosses the line or touches the line, the orders from the guards were shoot to kill. All right, so if they came up this line, so in the places that had walls, you can think of it like a castle with a moat around it, except the moat's on the inside, and then there's a little border that runs around the inside. If you got near the line, orders were shoot to kill, not shoot to injure, shoot to kill. And so you can imagine, many people were killed this way. Some were accidents, some were murders. And then you had people also commit suicide this way. They couldn't take it anymore. And so they knew if they crossed the deadline, their problem of being a prisoner of war would end. So that's where deadline originated. All right. Now, we're going to fast forward through some time. By the 1920s, the word deadline had been adapted into journalism. So y'all might be more familiar with that one. And it went from being a line that you would cross that would get you killed into a time limit, more of a time limit type thing. All right, so now we're at that time where something has to be completed. Schoolwork, jobs, contests, that's where a deadline has become its sort of popular use. So I wanted to share a couple of things with you about my experiences with deadlines. And I'm going to say they were positive. They didn't initially seem positive at the time, but it was two important lessons I learned about meeting deadlines. I think it helped me as a writer. And I think if you can learn to embrace deadlines and work with them, I think it'll help you as a student. It will definitely help you when you get out in the working world. So when I was a student here, I was working part-time for the newspaper in Raleigh News and Observer. And I was going out and covering sports events mostly for them. And so it was high school football playoffs, and they would send us out to cover these games. So I don't know if y'all remember phone booths. Y'all know what I'm talking about when I say a phone booth? Kind of seems like an ancient thing. They were still around in the 90s. Anybody watch Doctor Who? Y'all know what I'm talking about, right? So we had these phone booths. And so what we had to do, nobody had a cell phone in the early 90s unless they were a wealthy person, had one in their car. And so what you did if you were a reporter, you went out to the game, you covered the game ended, you had to go get quotes from both coaches, and then you had to go find a phone booth. So if y'all are not from this area, if you ride around a little bit, find the places that look like would be a perfect place to kill somebody, and that's where the phone booths were. All right? They were out in the middle of nowhere, sometimes a country store parking lot. Might be one light hanging on. So they're pretty scary places, but this is how it worked. You had to go get your quotes. I would sit in my car, make a few quick storylines because it was a fairly short story. They were usually about 6 inches on the page, 6 to 8 inches. And you had to go in there. And then here's another term you might not know about. I had to make a collect call. Does anybody know what collect call is? All right. So in the days before cell phones, if you called somebody over we'll say long distance, which in those days, y'all know where Bailey is from here? Stantonsburg. That would have been local. Anything beyond that would have been considered long distance, which means you had to pay for it. So you had to go to the phone booth. You couldn't put enough. It was either put a bunch of quarters in or call collect. So I would have to go call collect to get the story in. All right. So y'all kind of get the idea. All right. So deadline was 11 o'clock. Didn't matter what time the game ended. Deadlines were at 11. So we had a game. I think it wasn't actually that far from here. I think that game was either in Edgecombe or maybe a county a little bit farther east. Game went into overtime and then another overtime. And it was getting pretty close to 11 o'clock. So I got all my stuff I had to get. I went to a phone booth and I called a guy working the desk. It was a guy that had worked there forever. I kind of knew him. And I asked him, I said, can I get some extra time? Because, the game went into overtime. It's going to be a good story, but I don't it's 10 till. And he said, no, you can't. Paper's got to get out. And, that's the fact. I mean, you can't they're not going to give the advertisers their money back. So the paper had to get out. He said, but you can do it. He's like, you watched the game, you just came from the game, you got your quotes. He said, take a deep breath, think about it, and write the story over the phone. So that's what I did. I wrote the story, just looked at my notes real quick, wrote the story over the phone, came out the next day. Nobody would have any idea. All right. So what did that do for me? There was a couple of reasons. Here's the motivations. This is how you got to think about deadlines. So the motivation was I had driven all these miles to cover the game. No story means no pay. Mr. K can tell you that, right? Our other journalism person, so you don't get paid. And then the other thing was, for the part-time reporters, it was a competitive thing. And so as the playoffs go on, you guys know if you play sports, there gets to be fewer teams, which means fewer games to cover. So there was kind of a competition. You wanted to keep advancing as a reporter to the next week. So if you don't do your story, you're out of the running. So you had a couple of motivations. So I would say those are my motivations, was to stay in the running, to continue the playoffs, because once they got down to the finals, then the guys that worked full time for the paper were doing it. So that was a motivation for it. And so I used that pressure to write the story on the fly. And so that's kind of what I'm getting at, is use that pressure to your advantage. I'm going to talk about brains here in a minute, how that kind of works. A few years later, I had the same thing happen where I got my first full-time newspaper job, and I didn't realize the editor had quit and walked out that day. And I had sent them a resume. They called me, and we did an interview. And the first thing they asked was, can you meet a deadline? And I'll come back to that again in a minute. Before they even asked to see any clips, we'll know if you can meet a deadline. And so we had the interview. This was in the morning, about mid-morning. And the guy that did the interview asked me how soon I could start. Well, I was pretty flexible being unemployed. So I was like, anytime you want, I just need to go home and change clothes. He said, well, great. Why don't you come back and start this afternoon? I said, good. So I'm getting ready to leave. And he says, by the way, do you think you can get a paper out today? And of course, you're 22, you're invincible. And I said, sure. And so the paper had to be done by 2 a.m. I started about 2 o'clock, and there was none of the pages done. And there was only 1 or 2 people that worked there. And well, we got it all done. But it was that pressure, right? We want to get a check, we'll make a good impression. So using the pressure positively is kind of what I'm getting at. And so those pressures and deadlines, when people call me about students that have graduated, so this is my 4th year, so I've had a few communication students graduate, and they'll use me as a reference. The very first question, every reference I've had on a student here has been, can they meet a deadline? Not can they write, not how's their grammar, anything like that. Can they meet a deadline? If I don't bring it up first, that's the first thing I get asked, is can they meet a deadline? And if you're freelancing, that's the first thing I run into too. It's the first thing I get asked when I'm new with somebody is, can you meet a deadline? Not, let me see your clips. That's the first question. I guess you could lie, but they find out pretty quick. And that's kind of how it works. I've had a lot of places where I was trying to get my foot in the door, and when I got my foot in the door, it never failed. They'd say your own time was number one, and then the second thing was your copy's clean, which means not a whole lot of editing has to be done, not a lot of grammar cleanup. So that's 2 important things if you're trying to do something in media. All right, so this is why in the writing classes, I used to say I don't take work late. Now, we had to ease up on that during COVID a little bit, because the thing's going on, but I continued to write during that time, and I didn't have a single publication that eased up on deadlines. And I'm not trying to put Mr. K on the spot, but I'm going to bet he had the same thing happen. He's still working in media.
Sometimes they got worse.
Sometimes it got worse. All right. So, and you can get fired for missing a deadline, but what is more likely to happen than getting fired is if you're a freelancer, you just stop getting work. Like, you might write a great story, but if you're a week late or a day late or a couple of hours late, they just stop calling you. It's not so much you got fired, it's just you didn't continue to be hired. And so that's something I think people don't think about when I say you can get fired. To me, that's kind of a way of getting fired is if you stop getting work, you've essentially been fired. So that's why they're important. All right, so let's talk about the brain a little bit. So with the right approach, deadlines can be very helpful because if you think about it, number one, they make whatever you're doing, whatever task you're doing, it makes it concrete all of a sudden because you got a time limit you got to hit. And that gives you a little bit of urgency. And so your brain sometimes likes urgency. It can motivate you. It might increase your level of commitment because you got to get it done. If you think through it, you can set a schedule. We try to talk about that in freshman English classes, planning out a timeline for hitting these things. So it helps you with your time management. And then I think the thing that gets overlooked, and if y'all think about it, I think you'll agree, is that meeting a deadline usually will give you, especially your brain, a level of satisfaction. You've done something, you got it in on time. And I think maybe it's underrated. I still remember, it's been a long time ago, right? I mentioned the 90s. That's like we used to tie our horses up out here when we got to class, right? That's ancient times. I still remember that night finishing that story that I had to write over the telephone in like 8 minutes, just going by notes. I still remember that feeling. So I'm saying, it's underrated, that feeling you get from meeting deadlines. So don't underestimate the power of that. So we know deadlines can cause anxiety and they can cause stress. And usually then there's a punishment and a reward. So if it's late, you might not get paid. You might get a 0. But if you get it in on time, there's a reward of getting it in on time. And then all the other intangibles that come with that. Just as bad as missing a deadline sometimes is having a long deadline. And I bet if y'all think about it, if you've had projects that you had to do and you had like months to do them, I bet you had a harder time working on them than something you had a short time frame. I find that in papers in class when things will happen and we'll have to reschedule because of weather or something comes up and the deadline has to be tight, and it seems like the papers are almost always better. And I think a vague deadline is a bad thing as well. I've got one right now I'm working on where I've been told to get it in by the fall. So what does that mean, right? To me, the fall is September 1st. On the calendar is September 20th. When does it end? December 20th? Is that the end of fall? And I'm struggling with this deadline because I don't really have a date. If I had a date, it'd probably already be done. So you think that's how your brain works. So when you come up to a deadline, the brain doesn't want to procrastinate. It wants to avoid consequences. And so there's a point where that can increase performance. So I'm going to give you a couple of terms, and then I'll wind it down so we can do questions. So the first one, I think you'll relate to all of these. Planning fallacy is the first one. All right. So the brain usually or often underestimates how long it takes to do something. And if y'all can't relate to that, then paint a bathroom in your house. And you'll know exactly, you will definitely underestimate how long that will take. It's a little looking room. You think you'll be done with it. But the brain usually underestimates how long it takes to do something. All right, then there's another term called the Yerkes-Dodson law. Yerkes-Dodson, Y-E-R-K-E-S. And that says that performance increases with arousal and stress to a certain point, and then after that point, it deteriorates. So that's kind of what I was talking about. Deadlines can motivate you and get you there unless you let them get the best of you, and then your brain deteriorates after a certain point. In other words, you start underperforming instead of using it to push your performance. And y'all are going to think I'm making this one up. There's one called student syndrome. I know this doesn't apply to any of y'all, but delay until right before the deadline. Now that is kind of a journalism thing. There's sometimes legitimate reasons you're waiting for something, but student syndrome is when you delay until right before the deadline. This other one, the last one is one of my favorites. It's called Parkinson's law. And it says that work expands to fill in the time allotted to complete a job. In other words, to increase your productivity, you have to allow yourself less time to complete a job. So whatever time you give yourself to complete something, that's how long it's going to take you to do it. So like if you're going to write this paper and you give yourself 3 weeks, you won't finish it in 2 weeks, you'll finish it in 3 weeks. If you give yourself 3 days, you'll finish it in 3 days, not 2 days. So that's Parkinson's law. All right, so the key to this is not to dread deadlines, but use them and manage them. It'll help your mental health if nothing else. Learning to write under pressure and write well under pressure is a valuable skill that will help you whatever job you're going to do. That will definitely help you. It's kind of like being clutch in a game. You think about it, the person who hits the free throw at the end of the game, kicks the field goal at the end of the game, that's not the first time they've done that. It's not the first time they've gone out and attempted whatever that play was. They've done it over and over before. So if you can get good at writing under pressure or be able to accomplish it, it's going to work for you whatever job you take. So a couple things to help you. Set specific goals. I see some people now with planners in class, bullet journals, things like that. Those are very helpful. We talk about in English class, freshman English, about breaking stuff down into smaller pieces. Set this much time to do your rough draft, allow some time to let it sit, go back and revise it. So think about how can you break it up, just like you would break up a 3-page paper, a 10-page paper, a 30-page paper. Set little milestones and mini deadlines. It's kind of what I was just saying. Figure out what your most productive time of the day is to work. I had a student on the collegiate. Her best time to work was 1 o'clock in the morning. So she would take a nap, and then she would work from 1 to 4. Now, we had to work out. She had to stop sending me messages from 1 to 4 in the middle of the night. That's when I discovered that little snooze thing on the iPhone. But that was her time. So you have to figure out what your time is. Some people are real productive first thing in the morning or before lunch, right after lunch. So figure out what your best time is. Use that. Change your environment, and you might have to change your approach. So, if you're having trouble writing and it's the noisy dorm room, where can you go? There's definitely places here you can escape. Some people need some noise. I don't know if any of y'all sleep with like a white noise machine, but I'm talking about sometimes you need a little bit, but figure out what your environment is if you need to change it. And then the last thing I would tell you is build in breaks. One of the most important things you're going to find in writing is having some cold time. So finish and then let that thing sit. So if it's a story you're writing or a paper you're writing, you need to give it at least 24 hours before you come back to it. Because your brain will fill in these little things. Like if you finish something and then get right into it to proofread it, your brain's going to fill in those things that aren't there because it's going to find them and put them in for you because you just touched it. So give yourself some cold time. So that cooling off time will help your writing, but you got to plan for it. You can't just do it on the fly. And if something's due this day, set your little timeline up and make sure that you're finished in time to have that cool off period so then you can come back to it. That's it. I'll take questions if anybody's got any or Tim doesn't get any. I think I ran over a little. Anyone have questions? Yeah.
What if the pressure doesn't motivate you? Like, I know it's supposed to, but what if it doesn't?
And when you say it doesn't motivate you, you mean you don't feel compelled to do whatever you're assigned?
Like you freeze. Like it's too much and you can't actually get it done because it's like looming deadline.
All right, so kind of overwhelming type feeling? I'm not trying to put words in your mouth, I just want to make sure. Okay, yeah. So if you feel overwhelmed, I would say go back to that schedule thing. So, let's say you went to class today and got assigned a paper, and let's say today's the 20th, it's due on the 30th. So forget the 30th being the turn-in day, work yourself backwards. And when y'all remember that old joke, how do you eat an elephant? Y'all ever heard that? How do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time, right? So break that paper down into bites. So I'm gonna do my research on the 21st. I'm gonna make an outline on the 21st, 22nd. I'm gonna have a draft on the 24th. I'm gonna let it sit on the 25th. I'm gonna revise it on the 26th, 27th. And think of it that way. In other words, break it down into little pieces. I think that usually works for most people. It's kind of like writer's block. We talk about that. Some people say it doesn't exist. I don't know about not existing. There's definitely different ways to deal with it. But I would say make it into a process. Not a formula, but a process. Instead of thinking, I've got 9 days to do this, think about what you're going to do each couple of days. Did that answer?
Yeah.
Anybody else? I think it was another hand. Anybody else have anything? Yeah.
I was just going to ask if you started off with, there's been, especially with teaching during COVID, a lot of people are rethinking the role of deadlines with teaching and whether, like people are experimenting with flexible schedules and things like that, which for me, I'm a deadline person, so that would have caused me a lot of anxiety as a student. But do you have any thoughts on some of these new conversations happening about surrounding deadlines and teaching?
Yeah, well, like I said, I've been in some things online where I've seen people arguing that you're just a tyrant if you have strict deadlines. But I think we're being not truthful with the student. At least in anything writing, media related, we're lying to them if we're telling them that deadlines are arbitrary. That's definitely a lie. It's definitely a lie. I think it's a lie in most things. Because what I think when I see it is that person's maybe not worked in one of those jobs that they're talking about. But, I've thought about having some assignments where you could turn them in anytime you want during the semester. Like I've turned it over my head for like just a minute. But then I realized you go back to these theories I laid out and almost everybody falls into one of them. And it's like, well, I got to write 4 this semester, no problem. And then all of a sudden that last deadline's up and now I got to write 4 this week. And I think, to me, it would create bad habits because instead of having somebody do one every 2 weeks, now they're trying to do 4 in like 24 hours kind of thing. I tried that with one particular assignment in one particular class, and it was like 100%. Everybody kind of let it pile up on them at the end. They had people on the last day of class asking me for topic ideas. It was due like in 2 hours. And, they were like, well, their brain just kept telling them, you got plenty of time. Do this. This is due now. Do this. My other class is due now. Do this. And then all of a sudden, we're on the last day. It's due in 2 hours. I hadn't done any of it. So that's I'm a deadline person too, obviously. So I just think it's a good habit. You just got to make them work for you. I know people get worked up over them, but it's just break it down into pieces, I think.
Any further questions? Hey, you
Would you say that working under pressure is a subconscious thing?
Yeah, I guess it can be because, I get assignments from places. I hate it though. Some people that I'll do freelance stuff for, they don't give me a date that is due, and I hate that. So I give myself one. Like if they don't give me one, I try to guess. Because some people you can ask and they're still kind of evasive. It depends on what you're trying to do. But I hate it because then you'll inevitably, if you don't give yourself a deadline, then they'll be like, where's my stuff? The stuff I didn't tell you I needed by a certain date, all of a sudden I need it. And so I guess it is kind of subconscious. You get into a habit of it after a while. Is that kind of what you're asking? Yeah. I think it's a good habit though. Self-imposed deadlines. And I've seen students, if I assign something that's due on the 20th, they just completely ignore the 20th and they give themselves it's due on the 18th. And I kind of admire them for being able to do that, right? In other words, they're giving them built-in kind of a buffer. I've seen them write it on their sheets, due date. They'll scratch out what I've got, put a different date on that. And it's a pretty good habit to start. I think it'll serve them pretty well. It's kind of rare, but you see it. Anybody else? Yeah. Yeah.
What do you do if you don't know what's going to be? You're trying to plan out a paper, these are the hours you're going to do it, these are the days you're going to do it, but you don't know what else is going to be that week. How do you plan for that when you don't know if there's going to be another big thing the next day that's going to be announced, or if, say the teacher hasn't even put in a due date for an assignment and you don't know when they're going to jump that on you? What do you do if other things aren't clear?
Yeah, that's a good question, and that stuff happens a lot. Especially if you work in journalism, you're working on a story, you're trying to finish it, and something happens, and you have to go cover that. So it's impossible to be completely bulletproof, for things that might come up. But I would say the biggest thing I see with people, either professionally or as students, is just waiting too long to get started. So I always tell people, if you get an assignment sheet today, go ahead and do the outline. You got something. Once you got something on the page, you can work with that. Even if your draft's terrible, your outline's terrible, you can work with something that's not blank. And so I would say just don't wait to start. Like, you got this minute that's right in front of you. Go ahead and start something. Even if it's, and when I say outline, I don't mean a particular one way of doing it. It might just be notes on a page. And then you got something. And then that thing comes up where you're not coming back to a blank page. You're coming back to a page that's got something on it that you can work from that. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Oh, yeah. Thank y'all. Thank you for coming.